Cynthilla's Tale and Shakespeare's Tragedy by John Edward Taylor, London, Chapman and Hall, 193 Piccadilly, 1855. Harvard College Library from the bequest of Everett Jansen Window, 1919. Dewey Decimal, call number 124271.20. Printed by John Edward Taylor, Little Queen Street, Lincoln's Inn Fields. Read by Kenosis Robert Neal. Othello. The work from which the plot and story of Shakespeare's Othello are taken belongs to the class of Italian novels which arose out of the popularity of Boccaccio's Decameroni, and was fostered by the taste prevalent in Italy during the 15th and 16th centuries. Although occasionally we meet with a tale of merit or interest, and a certain charm in style and language, these but partially atone for a coarse licentiousness, a reflection of the times, which, notwithstanding that it received the seal and license of the Inquisitor, who proclaimed them consonos sanctae ecclesiae et ab apostolica fide non abore, offend the moral sense of a pure age. The story of the Moor of Venice may be taken as a favorable specimen of the better class. It is contained in a collection of 100 tales, entitled Gli Hecatomiti by Giovan Battista Giraldi Cinthio, a work which has been rescued from oblivion simply by the accident of its having furnished the muse of Shakespeare with the plot of an incident of his Othello. The author was a nobleman of Ferrara and a professor of philosophy in that city. It is somewhat amusing to read the terms in which he speaks of the composition of his work, in connection with his grave studies of philosophy, by the light of which the fount and origin of laudable habits and all honest discipline, and likewise of every virtue, I have sought to perfect my work, which is wholly directed, with much variety of examples, to censure vicious actions and to praise honest ones, to make men fly from vice and embrace virtue. What could the reader expect after this proem, which is found totidem verbis in all the books of this school, but a work of untarnished purity and morality? All I can say is, he would be disappointed. Whether Shakespeare met with this story in the original Italian, in the French translation by Gabriel Chapuis, published at Paris in 1584, or which is perhaps most probable, in one of the numerous class of storybooks furnished from the Romance writers, which were widely circulated and read in the south of Europe, in an undecided question, but that Cinthio's tale forms the groundwork of Othello is a fact unquestioned by any critic. The Italian novel was published in 1565. This circumstance gives it a peculiar interest, which we shall proceed briefly to consider. The comparison which some critics have drawn between the relative merits of the play and the novel proceeds upon an erroneous principle. The same test of criticism is inapplicable to the two productions. There was wanting in the narrative of Cinthio, observes M. Guizot, the poetical genius which furnished the actors, which created the individuals, which imposed upon each a figure and a character, which made us see their actions and listen to their words, which presented their thoughts and penetrated their sentiments, the vivifying power which summons events to arise, to progress, to expand, to be completed, that creative breath which, breathing over the past, calls it again into being, and fills it with a present and imperishable life. This was the power which Shakespeare alone possessed, and by which, out of a forgotten novel, he made Othello. This passage is eloquently true as a criticism of Shakespeare's play, but does not apply to Cinthio's tale. In fact, it only defines the province of the dramatic poet's art. Cinthio's story was no drama, but one of the plainest and most straightforward narratives, exhibiting human nature under its ordinary aspects and tracing the simple chain of events with ordinary regularity. There is no art in its structure, no consideration in its arrangement, and it consequently lays claim to merit beyond what it may possess in point of style, consistency, and general truth to nature. It was not a true tale, but it might have been. My intention in this work, says the author, was above all to narrate events the most like truth, which might, together with innocent amusement, bring also some profit to every class of persons. On each of the grounds just mentioned, the claim of this tale to considerable merit may be admitted. Apart from any invidious comparison with the infinitely grander fabric which Shakespeare has erected out of its simple materials. At the same time, a comparison of a different and more legitimate kind may be profitably drawn. The greatness of any work of art in conception, form, and execution serves to enhance the interest which attaches to the elements of thought out of which it arose. With what eagerness do we regard the first studies of any of the great masters, tracing the elementary thoughts, their treatment and changes under the artist's hand. Studies of nature, snatched with a passing stroke of the pencil, to be eventually immortalized in some masterpiece of art. An interest akin to this is offered by the tale before us. In it, we trace the suggestions out of which was produced one of the most perfect triumphs of dramatic art. The incidents, traits of characters, and motives which Shakespeare has adopted, enlarged, altered, ennobled, the skeleton which he has informed with life, dignity, and beauty, all give back a reflected charm to the original story, which in its first and naked form it wanted. The simple elements of the story were precisely calculated to seize upon Shakespeare's attention. The opposition and contrast of characters, the deep play of the passions, the suggestive motives, thoughts, and springs of action, the capabilities of the plot, were all materials as if created for his genius to mold, work upon, and fashion. To a few points of similarity in some of the changes the poet has introduced, we may here advert. Desdemona, both in the play and novel, is the same affectionate and gentle being, the very soul of purity and honor, innocent as unsuspecting, trusting, and betrayed. Some of these points of character are but faintly sketched in the tale, but still visible. Her devotion to the Moor appears in several simple touches of the novelist. Her delight at the honor paid him by the Senate, her impatience that he should obey their summons, her eagerness to accompany him, adding that he could not love her did he imagine she could be happier to remain in safety than to share his dangers. Shakespeare departs from the story in the motives for Desdemona's interference for Cassio with the Moor. Cassio importunes her, and she pleads as for a suitor. She promises to do so as a vow of friendship to Cassio, and although she says to Othello, "Why, this is not a boon. 'Tis as I should entreat you to wear your gloves," or feed on nourishing dishes, or keep you warm, or sue to you to do a peculiar profit to your own person. This comes with only the force of an additional argument, urged for Cassio's sake. Again, in the Moor's presence, she says to Ludovico, I would do much to atone them, for the love I bear to Cassio, oath, fire, and brimstone. This was necessary to give full motive to the Moor's suspicions, to silence the questioning and scruples of his love and trust in Desdemona, and to establish in his mind her guilt beyond a doubt. But in the novel, when the Moor betrays his suspicion, she says, with much simplicity, Be not angered with me, my dear lord. I have no other cause to bid me speak than sorrow that I see you lose so dear a friend. Nor has he done so grave a fault that you should bear him so much enmity. Desdemona's pleading for the captain is prompted by the sole thought of her lord's own interest and sense of justice, which is the higher motive. Othello is a character of Shakespeare's creation. In the story, he is passionate in his affections, sudden to suspect, prompt to rage. Nevertheless, after he is convinced of his wife's guilt, his love pleads for her. It cannot be true, and he bursts out with the exclamation, By heavens, I scarce hold this hand from plucking out the tongue of thine, from plucking out that tongue of thine, which dares to speak such slander of my wife. And again, make thou these eyes self-witnesses of what thou tellest, or on thy life, I'll make thee wish thou hadst been born without a tongue, which suggests the exclamation Shakespeare has put into the mouth of Othello, in the torture of his bewilderment and doubt. Give me the ocular proof, or by the worth of thine eternal soul, thou hadst seen better have been born a dog, than answer my waked wrath. But the refined gentleness, the true nobility of soul, the unsuspecting truthfulness, and all the higher qualities which make up the story of Othello are wanting in the story. His revenge is of an ordinary stamp, and signified and satisfied with planned barbarity of execution, whereas in the tragedy the punishment of his wife's supposed guilt is not revenge, for not I did in hate, but all in honor. It is not a selfish prompting, but a feeling of necessity which his stern sense of justice lays on him, and again which his natural tenderness and love vainly wrestle. Yet she must die, or she'll betray more men. He is driven by the demon of fate to the verge of the precipice, to hurriedly to look back or to resist. Bewilderment deprives him of the power of reflection, and in the rapidity of the action in the play, he is rendered the helpless tool of Iago's villainy, which Shakespeare's plot required. We see the force of this necessity, which rules Othello strikingly after the deed is perpetuated, in the startled horror, the ghastly despair of his soul, when the portentous and damning doubt that is forced on his mind by the opening proofs of Iago's villainy and falsehood. Oh, I were damned beneath all depth of hell, but what I did proceed upon just grounds to this extremity. Oh, I were damned beneath all depth of hell, but that I did proceed upon just grounds to this extremity. And again, had she been true, if heaven would make me such another world, of one entire and perfect chrysolite, I'd not have sold her for it. The same inevitable law of consequence we may observe, which dominates the thoughts and conduct of Othello, conducts equally by the most consummate art the whole machinery of the play, shaping the plot determining the actions, overruling the wills, and leading on to a necessitated conclusion. The characters of the ensign and Iago are very similar, but whilst the former is a deep-dyed villain by habit, the latter is an unmitigated fiend by nature. Iago is one of the greatest impersonations of the evil spirit that has ever been suggested to an artist's mind. In the novel, the ensign's revenge is prompted solely by the resistance of Desdemona's virtue to his licentious arts, and is directed against her alone. She is his victim, but in the tragedy, the motives of Iago's hatred of Othello and Cassio are of a different nature, and his vengeance sweeping, universal, black, and terrible. He uses every one in turn as a tool to effect his purpose, and all are in turn his victims. His is a pure lust of villainy and revenge, for which, it is true, the motives appear at first inadequate, perhaps unnatural, as some critics have remarked, but a little consideration surely removes this objection. Had there been sufficient cause, however atrocious, for Iago to have been actuated by personal revenge, his guilt would have been simply the excess of wicked and unbridled passion, but by affixing to his conduct less natural motives, its malignity is rendered impropriation, fiend-like, passionless, and instinct with guilt in its most unmixed form of motiveless malignity. At the same time, Iago's revenge is not so entirely inadequate and vague as it has been represented. In the opening scene of the play, we see one chief cause of his hatred, both of the Moor and Cassio, but he afterwards avows other motives of jealousy, expressed in the strongest and plainest language, the thought whereof, he says, doth like a poisonous mineral gnaw my inwards, and nothing can or shall content my soul, till I am even with him, wife for wife, or failing so yet that I put the more, at least into a jealousy so strong that judgment cannot cure. It does not, however, appear in the tragedy that Iago practiced on the virtue of Desdemona, as he does in the tale. For as Mr. Knight observes, it is a part of the admirable knowledge of human nature possessed by Shakespeare that Iago does not, even for a moment, entertain the thought of tampering with the virtue of Desdemona, either through Cassio or Roderigo or any other instrument. No, in all probability, Shakespeare departed in this instance from the novel, purposely to bring this highest testimony to the virtue of Desdemona. Her purity was not only superior to assault or artifice, but above the reach of trial. Had she been tried and remained firm, her virtue would have been heroic. Removed from the possibility of trial, it is divine. And here we observe the well-balanced contrast to the villainy of Iago. The characters are extreme, or they would not correspond. Minor points of comparison will suggest themselves on a perusal of the story. In the latter, the ensign at the entreaty of the Moor attacks and wounds the captain, but in the play it is a natural conclusion of Iago's treatment of Roderigo to induce him to do the deed. This perfects the plot as regards Roderigo. He had been the dupe and tool of Iago as long as he could serve his purposes, but he was now become dangerous. The villainy had spun its last thread, and the web must break. One service more remained, to kill Cassio, and thus to relieve Iago of this dangerous deed, and at the same time to furnish him a pretext to slay Roderigo. A word or two, in conclusion, on the much vexed question among critics and actors respecting the color and nationality of the Moor. It is very probable, well observes Mr. Knight, that the popular notion of a Moor was somewhat confused in Shakespeare's time, and that the descendants of the proud Arabs who had borne sovereign sway in Europe men of royal siege, and what is more, had filled an age of comparative darkness with the light of their poetry and their science, were confounded with the uncivilized African, the despised slave. This probable confusion prevalent in that age is quite sufficient to explain the fact of Shakespeare's having placed a Negro's head upon the shoulders of one of the most noble and accomplished of the proud children of Omeyyades and the Abbasids. At the same time, I observe that this is no legitimate subject for dramatic criticism. In this point of view, we have merely to deal with the poet's own conception of the character, and to take this as the standard by which to judge its delineation. The drama as a work of art is simply amenable to the rules of art, and this is an instructive instance of the fact that artistic truth may consist with accidental errors which lie beyond the pale of art. The character of Othello may be in itself perfect, faultless, and yet when a nationality is affixed to it, it may violate the physical and moral laws of nature displayed in the distinction of races. This is a very minor point of mere speculation, not of criticism. Still, it is open to discussion. The novelist speaks of the blackness, negreza, of the Moor, and that Shakespeare had the outward figure of a black present to his thoughts appears more than probable, from numerous allusions in the play, such as thick lips, devil, sooty bosom, more fair than black, happily, for I am black, Othello says expressly, and again, my name is now begrimed in black, as mine own face. Nothing can be more conclusive than these expressions, and the tradition of the stage, there is reason to believe, has uniformly represented Othello as a black from Shakespeare's day to the present. Nevertheless, this in no degree affects the character of the Moor, for the reasons just stated. It is needless to remark on the differences in the concluding portion of the tragedy and novel. Amongst others, Shakespeare has omitted the ensign's accusation of the Moor to the Senate. Iago's vengeance on Othello had reached its culminating point, and his task of villainy was perfected. To have afterwards repeated his revenge in a mitigated form would have marred the structure of the drama. The epos perfected. The curtain falls. Cinthio's Tale of the Moor of Venice. There once lived in Venice a Moor, who was very valiant and of a handsome person, and having given proofs in war of great skill and prudence, he was highly esteemed by the Signoria of the Republic, who in rewarding deeds of valor advanced the interests of the state. It happened that a virtuous lady of marvelous beauty named Desdemona fell in love with the Moor, moved thereto by his valor, and he, vanquished by the beauty and the noble character of Desdemona, returned her love, and their affection was so mutual that although the parents of the lady strove all they could to induce her to take another husband, she consented to marry the Moor. And they lived in such harmony and peace in Venice, that no word ever passed between them that was not affectionate and kind. Now it happened at this time that the Signoria of Venice made a change in the troops whom they used to maintain in Cyprus, and they appointed the Moor commander of the soldiers whom they dispatched thither. Joyful as was the Moor at the honor proffered him, such dignity being only conferred on men of noble rank and well-tried faith, and who displayed bravery in arms, yet his pleasure was lessened when he reflected on the length and dangers of the voyage, fearing that Desdemona would be pained at his absence. But Desdemona, who had no other happiness in the world than the Moor, and who rejoiced to witness the testimony of his valor, her husband had received from so powerful and noble a republic, was all impatient that he should embark with his troops, and longed to accompany him to so honorable a post. And all the more it vexed her to see the Moor so troubled, and not knowing what could be the reason, one day when they were at dinner, she said to him, "How is it, O Moor, that when so honorable a post has been conferred on you by the Signoria, you are thus melancholy?" The Moor answered Desdemona, "My pleasure at the honor I have received is disturbed by the love I bear you. For I see that of necessity one of two things must happen, either that I take you with me to encounter the perils of the sea, or to save you from this danger, I must leave you here in Venice. The first could not be otherwise than serious to me, for all the toil you would have to bear, and every danger that might befall you, would cause me extreme anxiety and pain. Yet were I to leave you behind me, I should be hateful to myself, since in parting from you, I should part from my own life." Desdemona, on hearing this, replied, "My husband, what thoughts are these that wander through your mind? Why let such things disturb you? I will accompany you whithersoever you go. Were it to pass through fire, as now to cross the water in safe and well-provided ship. If indeed there are toils and perils to encounter, I will share them with you. Si periturus ibis, et mi rape in omnia tecum. And in truth, I should think you loved me little were you to leave me here in Venice, denying me to bear you company, or could believe that I would liefer bide in safety here than share the dangers that await you. Prepare then the voyage with all the readiness which the dignity of the post you hold deserves." The Moor, in the fullness of his joy, threw his arms around his wife's neck, and with an affectionate and tender kiss exclaimed, "God keep you long in such love, dear wife." Then speedily donning his armor, and having prepared everything for his expedition, he embarked on board the galley with his wife and all his troops. And setting sail, they pursued their voyage, and with a perfectly tranquil sea arrived safely at Cyprus. Now amongst the soldiery there was an ensign, a man of handsome figure, but of the most depraved nature in the world. This man was in great favor with the Moor, who had not slightest idea of his wickedness, for despite the malice lurking in his heart, he cloaked with proud and valorous speech, and with a specious presence, the villainy of his soul, with such art that he was to all outward show another Hector or Achilles. This man had likewise taken with him his wife to Cyprus, a young and fair and virtuous lady, and being of Italian birth, she was much loved by Desdemona, who spent the greater part of every day with her. In the same company there was a certain captain of a troop, to whom the Moor was much affectioned, and Desdemona for this cause, knowing how much her husband valued him, showed him proof of the greatest kindness, which was all very grateful to the Moor. Now the wicked ensign, regardless of the faith that he had pledged his wife, no less than of the friendship, fidelity, and obligation which he owed the Moor, fell passionately in love with Desdemona, and bent all his thoughts to achieve his conquest. Yet he dared not to declare his passion openly, fearing that, should the Moor perceive it, he would at once kill him. He therefore sought in various ways, and with secret guile, to betray his passion to the lady. But she, whose every wish was centered in the Moor, had no thought for the ensign more than for any other man, and all the means he tried to gain her love had no more effect than if he had not tried them. But the ensign imagined that the cause of his illness but the ensign imagined that the cause of his ill success was that Desdemona loved the captain of the troop, and he pondered how to remove him from her sight. The love which he had borne the lady now changed into the bitterest hate, and having failed in his purposes, he devoted all his thoughts to plot the death of the captain of the troop, and to divert the affection of the Moor from Desdemona. After revolving in his mind various schemes, all alike wicked, he at length resolved to accuse her of unfaithfulness to her husband, and to represent the captain as her paramour. But knowing the singular love the Moor bore to Desdemona, and the friendship which he had for the captain, he was well aware that, unless he practiced an artful fraud upon the Moor, it were impossible to make him give ear to either accusation. Wherefore he resolved to wait until time and circumstance should open a path for him to engage in his vile project. Not long afterwards it happened that the captain, having drawn his sword upon a soldier of the guard and struck him, the Moor deprived him of his rank, whereat Desdemona was deeply grieved, and endeavored again and again to reconcile her husband to the man. This the Moor told to the wicked ensign, and how his wife importuned him so much about the captain, that he feared he should be forced at last to receive him back to service. Upon this hint, the ensign resolved to act, and began to work his web of intrigue. Perchance, said he, the Lady Desdemona may have good reason to look kindly on him. And wherefore? Said the Moor. Nay, I would not step twixt man and wife, replied the ensign, but let your eyes be witness to themselves. In vain the Moor went on to question the officer. He would proceed no further. Nevertheless, his words left a sharp stinging thorn in the Moor's heart, who could think of nothing else, trying to guess their meaning, and lost in melancholy. And one day, when his wife had been endeavoring to pacify his anger toward the captain, and praying him not to be unmindful of ancient services and friendship for one small fault, especially since peace had been made between the captain and the soldier he had struck, the Moor was angered, and exclaimed, Great cause have you, Desdemona, to care so anxiously about this man. Is he a brother or your kinsman, that he should be so near to your heart? The lady, with all gentleness and humility, replied, Be not angered, my dear lord. I have no other cause to bid me speak than sorrow that I should see you lose so dear a friend as, by your own words, this captain has been to you. Nor has he done so grave a fault, that you should bear him so much enmity. Nay, but you Moors are of so hot a nature that every little trifle moves you to anger and revenge. Still more enraged at these words, the Moor replied, I could bring proofs, by heaven it mocks belief. But for the wrongs I have endured, revenge must satisfy my wrath. Desdemona, in astonishment and fright, seeing her husband's anger kindled against her, so contrary to his wont, said humbly and with timidness, None save a good intent has led me thus to speak with you, my lord, but to give cause no longer for offense. I'll never speak a word more on the subject. The Moor, observing the earnestness with which his wife again pleaded for the captain, began to guess the meaning of the ensign's words, and in deep melancholy he went to seek that villain, and induce him to speak more openly of what he knew. Then the ensign, who was bent upon injuring the unhappy lady, after feigning at first great reluctance to say aught that might displease the Moor, at length pretended to yield to his entreaties, and said, "I can't deny, it pains me to the soul to be thus forced to say what needs must be more hard to hear than any other grief. But since you will it so, and that the regard I owe your honor compels me to confess the truth, I will no longer refuse to satisfy your questions and my duty. Know then that for no other reason is your lady vexed to see the captain in disfavor, than for the pleasure that she has in his company whenever he comes to your house, and all the more since she has taken an aversion to your blackness." These words went straight to the Moor's heart, but in order to hear more, not that he believed true all that the ensign had told him, he replied, with a fierce glance, "By heavens, I scarce can hold this hand from plucking out that tongue of thine, so bold, which dares to speak such slander of my wife." "Captain," replied the ensign, "I looked for such reward for these my faithful offices, none else. But since my duty and the jealous care I bear your honor have carried me thus far, so Iago says, I do not like the office, but sith I am entered in this cause so far, pricked to it by foolish honesty and love, I will go on. I do repeat, so stand the truth, as you have heard it from these lips. And if the lady Desdemona hath, with a false show of love for you, blinded your eyes to what you should have seen, this is no argument but that I speak the truth. Nay, the same captain told it me himself, like one whose happiness is incomplete until he declare it to another. And but that I fear your anger, I should have given him, when he told it me, his merited reward, and slain him. But since informing you of what concerns more you than any other man, brings me so undeserved a recompense, what I had held my peace, since silence might have spared me your pleasure, since silence might have spared me your displeasure. Then the Moor, burning with indignation and anguish, said, Make thou these eyes self-witnesses of what thou tellest, or on thy life I'll make thee wish thou hadst been born without a tongue. An easy task it would have been, replied the villain, when he was used to visit at your house. But now that you have banished him, not for just cause, but for more frivolous pretext, it will be hard to prove the truth. Still I do not forego the hope to make you witness of that which you will not credit from my lips. Thus they parted. The wretched Moor, struck to the heart as by a barbed dart, returned to his home and awaited the day when the ensign should disclose to him the truth which was to make him miserable to the end of his days. But the evil-minded ensign was, on his part, not less troubled by the chastity which he knew the Lady Desdemona observed inviolate, and it seemed to him impossible to discover a means of making the Moor believe what he had falsely told him, and turning the matter over in his thoughts in various ways, the villain resolved on a new deed of guilt. Desdemona often used to go, as I have already said, to visit the ensign's wife, and remained with her a good part of the day. Now the ensign observed that she carried about her a handkerchief which he knew the Moor had given her, finely embroidered in the Moor's fashion, and which was precious to Desdemona, nor less so to the Moor. Then he conceived the plan of taking this handkerchief from her secretly, and thus laying the snare for her final ruin. The ensign had a little daughter, a child 3 years of age, who was much loved to Desdemona, and one day when the unhappy lady had gone to pay a visit at the house of this vile man, he took the little child up in his arms, and carried her to Desdemona, who took her and pressed her to her bosom, while at the same instant this traitor, who had extreme dexterity of hand, drew the handkerchief from her sash so cunningly that she did not notice him, and overjoyed he took his leave of her. We lose this pretty scene in the tragedy, where Iago obtains it from Emilia, who had found it dropped by chance, and thus comprises his own wife in the scheme of his villainy. Desdemona, ignorant of what had happened, returned home, and, busied with other thoughts, forgot the handkerchief. But a few days afterwards, looking for it, and not finding it, she was in alarm, lest the Moor should ask her for it, and as he oft was wont to do. Meanwhile, the wicked ensign, seizing a fit opportunity, went to the captain of the troop, and with crafty malice left the handkerchief at the head of his bed, without his discovering the trick, until the following morning, when on his getting out of bed, the handkerchief fell upon the floor, and he set his foot upon it. And not being able to imagine how it had come into his house, knowing that it belonged to Desdemona, he resolved to give it to her, and waiting until the Moor had gone from home, he went to the back door and knocked. It seemed as if fate conspired with the ensign to work the death of this unhappy Desdemona. Just at the time the Moor returned home, and hearing a knocking at the back door, he went to the window, and in a rage exclaimed, "Who knocks there?" The captain, hearing the Moor's voice, and fearing lest he should come downstairs and attack him, took to flight without answering a word. The Moor went down, and opening the door, hastened into the street, and looked about, but in vain. Then returning into the house, in great anger, he demanded of his wife who it was that had knocked at the door. Desdemona replied, as was true, that she did not know, but the Moor said, "Seems to me the captain." "I know not," answered Desdemona, "whether it was he or another person." The Moor restrained his fury, great as it was, wishing to do nothing before consulting the ensign, to whom he hastened instantly, and told him all that he had passed, praying him to gather from the captain all he could respecting the affair. The ensign, overjoyed at the occurrence, promised the Moor to do as he requested, and one day he took occasion to speak with the captain, when the Moor was so placed that he could see and hear them as they conversed, and whilst talking to him of every other subject than of Desdemona, he kept laughing all the time aloud, and feigning astonishment, he made various movements with his head and hands, as if listening to some tale of marvel. As soon as the Moor saw the captain depart, he went up to the ensign to hear what he had said to him, and the ensign, after long entreaty, at length said, "He has hidden from me nothing, and has told me that he has been used to visit your wife whenever you went from home, and that on the last occasion she gave him this handkerchief which you presented to her when you married her." The Moor thanked the ensign, and it seemed now clear to him that, should he find Desdemona not to have the handkerchief, it was all true that the ensign had told him. One day, therefore, after dinner, in conversation with his wife on various subjects, he asked her for the handkerchief. For the kerchief. The unhappy lady, who had been in great fear of this, grew red as fire at the demand, and to hide the scarlet of her face, which was closely noted by the Moor, she ran to a chest and pretended to seek the handkerchief. And after hunting for it a long time, she said, "I know not how it is, I cannot find it. Can you perchance have taken it?" If I had taken it, said the Moor, why should I ask you of it? But you will look better another time. On leaving the room, the Moor fell to meditating how he should put his wife to death, and likewise the captain of the troop, so that their death should not be laid to his charge. And as he ruminated over this day and night, he could not prevent his wife's observing that he was not the same toward her as he had been wont. And she said to him again and again, what is the matter? What troubles you? How comes it that you... And as he ruminated over this day and night, he could not prevent his wife's observing that he was not the same toward her as he had been wont. And she said to him again and again, what is the matter? What troubles you? How comes it that you, who were the most light-hearted man in the world, are now so melancholy? The Moor feigned various reasons in reply to his wife's questioning. But she was not satisfied, and although conscious that she had given the Moor no cause, by act or deed, to be so troubled, yet she feared that he might have grown wearied of her. And she would say to the ensign's wife, I know not what to say of the Moor. He used to be all love toward me, but within these few days he has become another man. And much I fear that I shall prove a warning to young girls not to marry against the wishes of their parents, and that the Italian ladies may learn from me not to marry a man whom nature and habitude of life estrange from us. But as I know the Moor is on such terms of friendship with your husband, and communicates to him all his affairs, I pray you, if you have heard from him aught that you may tell me of, fail not to befriend me. And as she said this, she wept bitterly. The ensign's wife, who knew the whole truth, her husband's wishing to make use of her to compass the death of Desdemona, could never consent to such a project, dared not, from fear of her husband, disclose a single circumstance. All she said was, beware lest you give any cause of suspicion to your husband, and show to him by every means your fidelity and love. Emilia, unlike the ensign's wife, is unconscious of the wicked project of her husband. She tells Desdemona that she knows not of the handkerchief. At the same time, she more than once insinuates, is he not jealous? In the story, she dares only suggest a significant caution. Indeed, I do so, replied Desdemona, but it is all of no avail. Meanwhile, the Moor sought in every way to convince himself of what he fain would have found untrue, and he prayed the ensign to contrive that he might see the handkerchief in the possession of the captain. This was a difficult matter to the wicked ensign. Nevertheless, he promised to use every means to satisfy the Moor of the truth of what he said. Now the captain had a wife at home, who worked the most marvelous embroidery upon the lawn. And seeing the handkerchief which belonged to the Moor's wife, she resolved before it was returned to her to work one like it. In the play, Cassio gives the handkerchief to Bianca to imitate, saying, I found it in my chamber, I like the work well, ere it be demanded, as like enough it will, I'll have it copied, take it and do it. As she was engaged in this task, the ensign observed her standing at a window where she could be seen by all passers-by in the street, and he pointed her out to the Moor, who was now perfectly convinced of his wife's guilt. Then he arranged with the ensign to slay Desdemona, and the captain of the troop, entreating them as it seemed they both deserved. The Moor prayed the ensign that he would kill the captain, promising eternal gratitude to him, but the ensign at first refused to undertake so dangerous a task, the captain being a man of equal skill and courage, until at length, After much entreating and being rapidly paid, the Moor prevailed on him to promise to keep the deed. Having formed this resolution, the ensign, going out one dark night, sword in hand, met the captain on his way to visit a courtesan, and struck him a blow on the right thigh, which cut off his leg and felled him to the earth. Then the ensign was on the point of putting an end to his life, when the captain, who was a courageous man, and used to the sight of blood and death, drew his sword, and wounded as he was, kept on defense, exclaiming with a loud voice, "I'm murdered!" See the remark in my introduction to the story. The maiming is the same in the tragedy. Iago cuts Cassio behind in the leg, but does not lop off the limb. It would have been rather awkward and unbefitting for Cassio to have been brought on to the stage as the captain in the story, stumping about with a wooden leg. Thereupon the ensign, hearing the people come running up, and with some of the soldiers who were logged thereabout, took to his heels to escape being caught. Then turning about again, he joined the crowd, pretending to have been attracted by the noise. And when he saw the captain's leg cut off, he judged that, if not already dead, the blow must at all events end his life. And whilst in his heart he rejoiced at this, he feigned to compassionate the captain as he had been his brother. The next morning the tidings of his affair spread through the whole city, and reached the ears of Desdemona, whereat she, who was kind-hearted and little dreamed that any ill would betide her, evinced the greatest grief at the calamity. This served but to confirm the Moor's suspicions. And he went to seek for the ensign, and said to him, "Do you know that as my wife is in such grief at the captain's accident, that she is well nigh gone mad? And what could you expect, seeing he is her very soul?" replied the ensign. "Ah, soul forsooth!" exclaimed the Moor. "I'll draw the soul out from her body. Call me no man, if that I fail to shut the world upon this wretch." Then they consulted of one means and another, poison and daggers, to kill poor Desdemona, but could resolve on nothing. At length the ensign said, "A plan comes to my mind, which will give you satisfaction, and raise cause for no suspicion. It is this: the house in which you live is very old, and the ceiling of your chamber has many cracks. I propose we take a stocking, filled with sand, and beat Desdemona with it till she dies. Thus will her body bear no signs of violence. When she is dead, we can pull down a portion of the ceiling, and thus make it seem as if a rafter falling on her head had killed the lady. Suspicion cannot rest on you, since all men will impute her death to accident." This cruel counsel pleased the Moor, and he only waited for a fitting time to execute the plot. One night, when he and Desdemona had retired to bed, the ensign, whom the Moor had concealed in a closet which opened into the chamber, raised a noise in the closet, according to a concerted plan, whereat the Moor said to his wife, "Did you not hear that noise?" "Indeed I heard it," she replied. "Rise," said the Moor, "and see what 'tis." The unhappy Desdemona rose from bed, and the instant she approached the closet, out rushed the ensign, and being strong and of stout nerve, he beat her cruelly with the bag of sand across her back, upon which Desdemona fell to the ground, scarce able to draw her breath. But with the little voice she had left, she called upon the Moor for aid. But the Moor, leaping from bed, exclaimed, "Thou wickedest of women! Thus has thy falseness found its just reward, the recompense to wives, who, counterfeiting love, place horns upon their husbands' brows." The wretched lady, hearing these words, and feeling that she was near her end, for the ensign had given her another blow, appealed to the justice of heaven, since justice here had failed her, in proof of her fidelity and truth. And as she was thus calling heaven to witness, the ensign inflicted a third blow, under which she sank lifeless on the floor. Then the ensign and the Moor, laying Desdemona on the bed, and wounding her head, pulled down part of the ceiling of the chamber as they had arranged, whereupon the Moor began to call aloud for help, exclaiming that the house was falling. Hearing this uproar, the neighbors all came running up, and there found Desdemona lying dead beneath a rafter, a sight which, from the good life of the poor lady, did fill our hearts with sorrow. On the following day Desdemona was buried, followed to the grave by the universal grief of the people. But heaven, the just regarder of all hearts, willed not that so wicked a deed should go unpunished. Ere long the Moor, whom Desdemona had loved more than her own life, began to feel such sorrow at her loss that he went wandering about, as one bereft of reason, searching in every part of the house, and reflecting in his thoughts that the ensign had been the cause that he had lost, with Desdemona, all joy in life. He conceived so deep a hatred to that wicked man, he could not bear to set eyes on him, and had it not been for his fear of the inviolable justice of the Signoria of Venice, he would have slain him openly. But being unable to do this with safety, he deprived him of his rank, and would not allow him to remain in his company, whereat such an enmity arose between them that no greater or more deadly can be imagined. The ensign, the wickedest of all bad men, now turned his thoughts to injuring the Moor, and seeking out the captain, whose wound was by this time healed, and who went about with a wooden leg in place of the one that had been cut off, he said to him, "'Tis time ye should be avenged for your lost limb, and if you will come with me to Venice, I'll tell you who the malefactor is, whom I dare not mention to you here for many reasons, and I will bring you proofs." The captain of the troop, whose anger returned fiercely, but without knowing why, thanked the ensign, and went with him to Venice. On arriving there, the ensign told him that it was the Moor who had cut off his leg, on account of the suspicion he had formed of Desdemona's conduct with him, and for that reason he had slain her, and then spread the report that the ceiling had fallen and killed her. Upon hearing which, the captain accused the Moor to the Signoria, both of having cut off his leg and killed his wife, and called the ensign to witness the truth of what he said. The ensign declared both charges to be true, for that the Moor had disclosed to him the whole plot, and had tried to persuade him to perpetrate both crimes, and that having afterwards killed his wife, out of jealousy he had conceived, he had narrated to him the manner in which he had perpetrated her death. The Signori of Venice, when they heard of the cruelty inflicted by a barbarian upon a lady of their city, commanded that the Moor's arms should be pinioned in Cyprus, and he be brought to Venice, where with many tortures they sought to draw from him the truth. But the Moor, bearing with unyielding courage all the torment, denied the whole charge so resolutely that no confession could be drawn from him. But although by his constancy and firmness he escaped death, he was, after being confined for several days in prison, condemned to perpetual banishment, in which he was eventually slain by the kinsfolk of Desdemona, as he merited. The ensign returned to his own country, and following up his wonted villainy, he accused one of his companions of having sought to persuade him to kill an enemy of his, who was a noble of high rank. Whereupon this person was arrested and put to the torture, but when he denied the truth Of what his accuser had declared, the ensign himself was likewise tortured to make him prove the truth of his accusation, and he was tortured so that his body ruptured, upon which he was removed from prison and taken home, where he died a miserable death. Thus did heaven avenge the innocence of Desdemona, and all these events were narrated by the ensign's wife, who was privy to the whole, after his death, as I have told them here. The End. Printed by John Edward Taylor, Little Queen Street,